The thoughts and ideas expressed in this episode are exclusively Jeremy Noble's opinion and does not reflect the views of the Army, Department of Defense, or Ranger Regiment. Hey guys, welcome to the Sua Sponte podcast. Again, I'm here with Jeremy Noble. He was the regimental psychologist from 2016 to 2021. And we're just going to talk about leadership. He put out a really good article that we will link to about why you should hire a ranger. If you guys haven't read it, it's a great article. And we just wanted to talk about that and some other issues pertaining to leadership and rangers and just psychologist stuff. So, Jeremy, thanks for coming on.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Ken.
So in the article, you talked about just regiment and how different we are. And so what do you think really sets a ranger apart from like a conventional Army guy or just someone that didn't go through what we went through?
Yeah. I'll tell you, rangers are very different in multiple ways. For one, a ranger is a bit of a masochist, for lack of a better word, because you guys voluntarily chose the most difficult route in the military. So most people don't join the military to begin with, but even fewer people join a special operations unit like the Ranger Regiment, where you're having to go through RASP or RIP, depending on when you went through. You're expected to go to Ranger School, and then every time somebody gets hired at regiment, or once they get hired, I usually have heard a board member say, all right, the easy part's done. Now the real work begins. Now you're going to be assessed for every day for the rest of your career. So there's an element of masochism there that has to be possessed for someone to come into the Ranger Regiment. So a better way to put it is grit, really. Rangers are some of the grittiest people that I think I've met. And you need that for the job, right? Like, you think about a place like a regiment, think about the mission of the Ranger Regiment. I mean, these are professional killers. These are guys that are going on target under the veil of night, kicking in doors, killing people. And if you are not gritty, you're not going to be able to do that job effectively. And more importantly, or just as important, you're not going to be able to handle the burden that comes along with that. It is, in my opinion, our ethical responsibility to make sure that we're screening out people who could potentially develop problems by being exposed to traumatic events and combat, like you're inevitably going to get exposed to at Ranger Regiment. So grit, hardiness, whatever you want to call it, that's a big piece. Another piece is something you and I were talking about before, and it's that bluntness, directness. What I talk about in the article is being a disagreeable giver. That I've seen in Ranger NCOs specifically, more so than I've seen that at regiment more so than anywhere else. And I'll explain what I mean by that for listeners who haven't read the article. So I didn't come up with that term. That came from an organizational psychologist, a guy by the name of Adam Grant, who I'm a big fan of, really impressive guy. But Adam Grant wrote this book called Give and Take. And what he said in the book is that you have people in the workplace or in organizations that are either givers or takers. So givers are selfless, they give to the organization. Takers are selfish, they do things for themselves. And then you have people who are agreeable, they're nice. And then you have people who are disagreeable. They don't care about your feelings. They're gonna be direct and blunt. And so that gives you four types of people. So you have agreeable givers, who are people who are nice, but they're like getting walked all over because they're doing everything for the organization, but they're too nice to say no. Then you've got agreeable takers, who are people who are nice to your face, but they're kind of behind your back doing things kind of shady. Then you've got disagreeable takers, which are people who are jerks, and they're also like selfish. These are the people you don't want in your organization at all. And then you get the disagreeable givers. These are the people that they're going to stand up and they're going to speak up when they feel like they need to, because their heart is in the right place. They're always doing it for the good of the organization. They have this sense of collective ownership with the organization. And that is what I've seen time and time again with Rangers, specifically Ranger NCOs, that they are disagreeable givers in every sense of the word. They are going to make sure that the right thing happens. And if the wrong thing happens, they're going to speak up in an after action review and let people know that the wrong thing happened and we need to fix this going forward.
Yeah, I think that's one thing for me transitioning out of the military was realizing, I think what Rangers do is we get behind the mission and we understand the purpose. And so I think that that's what causes that disagreeable giver in us is we're kind of like the entrepreneur of the company. Like, we believe in the mission. If not, we don't want to be here. And so we're all in and we want to fix anything and everything we can. And we always take that objective view of when we see something wrong, we're going to call it out because we want it to be better and we want it to be fixed.
Yeah. Yeah. And that, when you look at the literature on what makes an organizational culture effective, that is it. When you have employees that have collective ownership of the place, they are intrinsically motivated to do their jobs and to do well at their jobs because they care about the mission of the organization. They have that purpose in mind. They're not coming to work on time because they're afraid they're going to get yelled at. Like, that's extrinsic motivation. That can help with compliance, but that's not the key to long-term behavior change. The key to long-term behavior change is building intrinsic motivation in employees. And that is something that Ranger Regiment does incredibly well. I can't tell you how many times I've needed something, I've called the department or whatever, and I've made a request, and the answer I got was, "Gotcha, sir, I'm on it." And it was, if they ran into a wall, it wasn't "Oh, sorry, sir, I couldn't get it." It was, they're going to jump over that wall. They're going to figure out how to get to yes. And the only time they come back to me where they can't get it is when they've done everything that they possibly could to meet that request. And again, it's not because I was an officer and they were scared I was going to yell at them or punish them or anything like that. Like, I had no authority over them. They were in a different section, but it was because they believed in the mission of the organization, and that was part of their culture, is that, how do we make this happen? And so I wish I saw more of that, in organizations, in the civilian sector. Not that many don't have that, but it's more rare. I wish there was a way to bottle that up from Ranger Regiment and sell it, because then I'd be a very rich man.
Well, then everything would be great, right?
Exactly.
So another point you talk about is, as leaders, their self-awareness halts as they slowly move up the chain of command. They don't have peers around them that are willing to essentially be objective with them and tell them where they're at. They have several people that are willing to brown nose and just tell them what they want to hear so they can get what they want. Yeah. What do you think? Why does a Ranger come at that differently?
Yeah. I think it's that culture of accountability, and it's a habituation is the big word, right? Is the psychology word, but it's getting used to something. It is habituating to getting feedback from peers, getting and giving feedback. Regiment is a culture of peer accountability, and so when somebody messes up, or they do something or whatever, their peer is going to speak up and let them know. And so, going back to what we said earlier about being a disagreeable giver, they're doing it for the good of the organization, yes, but they're also doing it for the good of their Ranger buddy. Because if their Ranger buddy continues to behave in a certain way and it continues to cause problems for them, then they're not developing. They're not building self-awareness. They're not going to be successful. And so I think what happens at Regiment more than most places is Rangers are so used to giving each other feedback that that they don't view it as a threat. And that's the problem in places that are not used to getting feedback, is that when someone tells them that they've messed up, immediately in their mind, they hear, I've failed, which means I'm a failure. And so that creates this sort of threat reaction where they're going to try to defend themselves. And the way that they defend themselves is to tell the other person they're messed up, or to make excuses or whatever. And, you know, an example would be, let's say somebody, let's say an employee calls out a boss for something, and that boss does not like being told that he has messed up. Well, that boss could pull some kind of disciplinary action on that employee because it's that boss's way of like saving face, but it's not the right answer. That's a leadership failure, in my opinion. And so, long-winded response to your question, but I think what sets Rangers apart from that is that Rangers are used to giving and receiving feedback, and so when they get it, they only perceive it as that, as the message that's being sent to them, not as a threat to their competence or their character. And so they take that information and they do something with it. They make changes.
Yeah, and one thing, you know, I really learned this when I was in regiment. I didn't understand the whole tangible benefit of it. It was more intangible for me. But having a chain of command that when I screwed up, told me I screwed up and would address it with me and help me through the issue. And really, like, that's the definition of true love. You know, like, as a parent, as a husband, as a, you know, as an employee, like you really truly love somebody if you're willing, you know, to do the greatest good for them, regardless of the cost to you. So you might hate me, Jeremy, because I just told you care about your job or whatever, but maybe that's the realization you need to get better. And that I may have told you improperly, but the fact that I'm telling you is because I care about you, because, you know, maybe I just don't tell you and let you continue to screw up. That's unloving.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Because they're invested in your development. And like when you look at the research, I think Gallup has done some pretty good research on if somebody in the workplace, if they feel like someone else is there invested in their development, then they're more engaged. They're more productive employees. They're not just there to collect a paycheck, and they don't feel like their boss is just there to, you know, to enforce the rules, and that's that. And so you're right. Like your leaders in the past at regiment that told you when you were messed up, like they were doing it so you could get better. And like we don't learn unless we're told that we've done something wrong. Like we failure is learning, right? And
Yeah.
so like you can't learn from failure if you don't know you failed. And so, and if you don't have a leader to tell you that you failed, then they're failing, because they're not developing you. They're just kind of checking the block and moving on.
Well, and I think another part that's hard for people to understand about guys from Ranger Regiment is, you talk about in your article again, is humility, is that silent professional. We're not big on talking and selling ourselves. And I know we talked about, you've had guys reach out to you about, you know, like, how do I sell myself? And like, what kind of more advice do you have for a guy that comes from that silent, you know, professional background?
Yeah, yeah, another great question. Yeah, so about a year ago, I had a former ranger, reach out to me, and he hit me up and he was like, "Hey, he's like, I'm kind of struggling with the job hunt process post regiment," and he said that creating an online presence, displaying skills, experience, and knowledge goes directly against what we were taught, as professionals here, as quiet professionals here, and as a result, like we're not able to market ourselves appropriately, and we just kind of feel lost. And so from that, I pulled an article that, a colleague of mine and I, the colleague's name is Dan Seagrave. He and I wrote this article back in like 2018. And the intent for the article was to help Rangers transitioning out of the military. So it was something that a former regimental sergeant major, Sergeant Major Albaugh, Mike Albaugh, he asked us to write. And so I sent him that article. And I can send that article over to you if you want to make it available to the listeners.
Yeah, that'd be great.
But in that article, we at first what we did was we identified what the Ranger personality was, and we just kind of put words to it based on some of the data that we had. But two, we made recommendations on ways to kind of sell yourself. And number one is the self-awareness piece, is knowing who you are, like knowing the strengths that you bring to the table. And so when you look at those personality traits, the first category was Rangers are unbiased and direct. So that was what you and I were just talking about, is Rangers are those disagreeable givers. They're going to be more blunt. They're going to tell you how it is. And so that's a huge strength in many ways, because people know where they stand with you. They don't worry that you're going to like try to pull the wool over their eyes or anything like that. And it's refreshing for a lot of bosses, because not a lot of people know how to give direct feedback. They struggle with that. And I'm seeing it more and more and more as these younger generations get older and get into the workplace. People really, really struggle with conflict. And so Rangers bring this ability to have direct communication that a lot of people don't. Now, the flip side of that coin, or the other edge of that sword, is based on what you and I talked about a second ago, is that not everybody is secure with themselves. And so when a Ranger gives you direct feedback and tells you you're screwed up, then that person's going to take that and feel threatened and feel like they need to defend themselves. And depending on their position of power, they may do so in a inappropriate way. And so that's going to hurt the Ranger. So the tip there is to just kind of know that you have a tendency to be a little more blunt than most people. That's going to be in your nature. And to sort of soften it a little bit, or to kind of have a bit of a softer approach, be a little more assertive than aggressive. And like you can look up, there's tons of advice on like how to be assertive and assertive statements. So when you look at different forms of communication, you've got passive on one side, which is someone who just doesn't really speak up. You got aggressive on the other side, which is someone who they violate the other person's rights. They're name calling, they're yelling, but then what we want to strive for is assertive. And assertive is being able to express what you need without violating the rights of someone else. And so an example of like an assertive statement, a good skeleton sentence is starting with yourself and saying, I feel blank because blank. So an example would be like I feel disrespected because, when people show up late or something along those lines, right? You get what I'm saying, but by doing that kind of structure, when you start the sentence off with I, then you prevent that other person from getting in defensive mode. When you start a sentence off with you, people typically turn their ears off and they start thinking, how can they defend themselves? And so when you say, hey, I feel this way when this happens, then you're just creating a more receptive kind of environment. And I'm happy to post other things too, Ken. I can shoot you some examples and stuff of being assertive, but that would be like tip number one, right? So like Rangers know that they're more direct, they're more disagreeable than most people, and so it's important for them to know that about themselves and to really kind of try to tailor that approach, at least until people get to know you. I'll pause there because I feel like I'm talking a lot.
No, that's really good. The only thing like I've noticed, because I've been out a little over 10 years now. I started, pretty far on that line of being very blunt. I feel like one thing that's really helped me is not only telling someone they're screwed up, because that's one part, but I feel like the other part is that shows you really care about the person is when you tell them you're screwed up, be like, this is an example of what you should do. So it's one thing to like tell somebody they're wrong. It's another thing to tell them they're wrong and provide a solution.
Yeah.
And so like I generally try to think through the situation so I can provide a couple of situations in which they could do better. So they don't feel like I'm just telling them they're screwed up and there's no help there. I want to tell them what's screwed up, but also tell them ways to fix it.
Yeah. Yeah. I like that a lot because now you're invested in their development. You're not just punishing them, or you're not just telling them that they've done things wrong. You're saying, hey, here's how I'd like you to do this going forward. There's a couple of other techniques that come to mind for me. One of them is called the SBII method. So it's kind of a framework for giving negative feedback to somebody. So the S is the situation. So you just state in like one line the situation. So so hey, remember the other day when this happened? So that's the S. So you kind of outline, here it is. The B is behaviors. And so this is where you describe their behaviors in very objective, non-emotional terms. And so you kind of speak to them like you're like a reporter reporting the facts. Not one of these political media reporters, but one of the ones that are much more objective. But you speak to the facts, and then the next I is intent. So this is where you say, hey, what was your intent with that? Like, you give them that opportunity to explain themselves, because sometimes things happen. Sometimes there's some sort of extenuating circumstances that maybe you weren't tracking. And then the last I is the implications. And so this is where you explain the implications of their behavior and what that means and why that's wrong. And then I would tack on what you just said of like, hey, here's how I would like this to go in the future. There's a psychological phenomenon called the fundamental attribution error. And the whole idea is that we as human beings, we have a tendency to attribute other people's behavior to their traits, to their personality. Whereas if we do the same behavior, we attribute it to the situation. So if you go to McDonald's and somebody's being really, really rude to the staff, then we're more likely to think that's a rude person. But if we are being rude to the staff, then we usually attribute that to, well, they got my order wrong 3 times, or they, or I've had a really bad day, or whatever. And it's called the fundamental attribution error for a reason, because it's fundamental. Like, a lot of people fall into that. And so Rangers are not immune to that. Like, if we see somebody do something wrong at work, then our immediate reaction would be, this person's screwed up. Like, this person is lazy or whatever. And so I think it's important to sort of do your due diligence and kind of say, hey, what happened? What's going on? Like, ask questions first to help them get their side of the story, and then provide the, hey, here's the implications of that. Here's why this is not good, and here's how I want you to do that going forward. And then one more thing I'll throw out there. This is something that comes from that psychologist, Adam Grant, that I told you about earlier. But when you give feedback to somebody, negative feedback to somebody, and you're in a supervisory role, a lot of times it helps to preface it by saying, hey, I want to give you this feedback because people have given me feedback in the past, and I found it very beneficial. And I have high standards, but I'm confident you can meet those. And then you provide the feedback. And so what you're doing is you're telling them exactly in the same spirit of what you said earlier, Ken. Is like, you're telling them, hey, I'm giving you this feedback, but this is not punishment. Like, this is a gift. I'm helping you develop. And I'm doing this out of a place of being a giver. Like, I'm wanting to help you be a better version of yourself and help the organization be a better version of itself.
Yeah, 2 things I was thinking about as you were saying that stuff is I feel like timeliness is important too. Like, not waiting, like a month to be like, oh, by the way, this is where you screwed up. And then also getting both sides of the story. Like, when you have 2 people in conflict, the Bible says, like, the first who comes to you will always seem right until the other one, provides their story. I feel like so often, even as a parent or just any type of leader, you know, there's always one person that rushes to you and tells you this is the story. And it's taking that pause to be like, man, I need to analyze this from both sides first before I pick a side. And that's often hard, but I think that that's really important too.
Yeah, it's great feedback. I always say there's three sides to every story, you know, like there's that one person, there's the other person, and there's something in the middle that is
You don't know. Yeah.
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 Because we're all biased. We're biased creatures. We're gonna shape the narrative to kind of fit with us. We're never the villain in our own story, right?
Yeah.
So yeah, I like that advice a lot. That making sure you don't jump to conclusions, you get that other side before you act.
So do you think like RASP is the fundamental part that pushes the leadership thing, or is it Ranger School? Is it that fact in Ranger Battalion that like at any point you realize you have to be a leader? Like you need to know the guy above you's position and below you, and like what effect does that have in the leadership thing? Because I feel like in civilian society, it's like I do whatever menial supervisor job I do, and I don't really prepare for the next level up.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm blanking on the name of that phenomenon. It'll come to me in a second, but it's the idea that in the civilian world, a lot of times if you do well in your position and you just stay there long enough, you get promoted into the next position. It's like if you're, we'll use construction for example. So let's say you're a construction worker and you do it for long enough. Before you know it, you get promoted into a leadership position, and now you're in charge of people. But you were never taught to like how to be a leader, and you just kind of had to figure it out on your own. And so then you just kind of lean on what you've sort of seen, like how you were led, or what you've seen in movies, or whatever. Whereas Ranger Regiment is a culture of leadership. And you asked, like, is it RASP? Is it Ranger School? What is it? I think it's a combination of everything. So I think it starts with the type of person that's attracted to a place like Ranger Regiment. Then those people enter a filter that is RASP, is the assessment selection program. And so in that program, we're screening out, or at least the intent is to screen out people that are not going to be good leaders. They're not going to be a good fit. Maybe they're not there for the right reasons. Maybe they're disagreeable takers, and they don't need to be in charge of people because they're worried about their own promotion, and they're not worried about developing those people underneath them. And so people go through RASP, and so we have that funneling effect. Then you get a minority of people that come out the other side. So like when you look at RASP 1, for example, there's like back when I was in the seat, it was like a 30% graduation rate, like it's low. Not everybody makes it. A lot of people quit, and then a lot of people can't make it through. And so you get a product that is filtered. And so then that product then kind of goes through this kind of gritty process, and Ranger School was one of those. This might get me in trouble, but I'm not a believer that Ranger School is a leadership school. I believe that Ranger School is a resilience school. It sends you through some really, really tough situations, and yes, you lead people through those tough situations. But when you come out the other side, I mean, I'll tell you from experience. Food tastes better. The sky was bluer. Like life was good when I got out of Ranger School in comparison to Ranger School. And so, and then also too, there's this phenomenon of shared hardship where when you go through something hard, you value it more. And when you go through this hard thing with other people and you get through the other side, where like not everybody that went in it came out the other side, like the ones that are together at the end that have gone through the hardship together, like they're bonded. And so now you take people that have gone through that filtering process, they've gone through that grit kind of making process of Ranger School in those first years at battalion, And now you spit them out into the organization where they're in this group, this culture of leaders. Like some of the best leaders I've ever seen in my life are the senior enlisted Rangers, the first sergeants that are in the organization, the sergeants major. The ones that I'm thinking of right now off the top of my head are just incredible leaders, some of the best I've ever seen. So I think it was John F. Kennedy that said, "A rising boat raises all ships," and that's it, man. That's regiment. It is, you get into it, and all of a sudden you're in this tide that's rising, and you've got to swim, or else you're going to drown. And so the ones that do rise with the tide are the ones that, like, they learn how to be leaders. And so yeah, so I mean that's my take, at least, is those kind of three components.
Well, I'll take the hit with you on that one. I don't think Ranger School is what it was meant to be anymore either. I think if you can go there for 9 months and still pass, that's probably an issue. I went to sapper school, which, because I was an engineer, I was a combat engineer. I thought it was a far better school, but also, I mean, me and Sergeant Gonzalez, we kind of joke with each other about it, but that school, you make it or you don't. It's no recycle rate, none of that. You go back to your unit and you're done. 30 days, or you get it or you don't. So, yeah. But even at that, that doesn't necessarily, make you the best leader just because you went through a 30-day or a 60-day school. But I think what you said about Ranger leaders, like first sergeants and stuff like that, those guys are great. I mean, they care about guys. They want to grow guys, and they wanted to make us better.
Yeah.
What advice do you, so like we've kind of talked about like Ranger struggles, but what advice would you have? You said you work with like companies. Would you tell like a boss that's going to hire a Ranger just to like give him an ability to be prepared? Like, hey, this guy's going to be blunt with you, but understand, stuff like along that vein.
Yeah. That's a great question. I've never been asked that before. I would almost want to like create a resume 2.0 for Rangers and give it to Rangers to give to their, to
buyer beware.
Yeah. I mean, essentially, right. But it's like, hey, here's what you're getting. And I don't want to say high risk, high reward, because you guys are not high risk in my opinion. But yeah, I mean, if I talked to a boss who was getting a Ranger, I would tell him or her a couple of things. The positives. So when you look at predictors of success in organizations, Rangers have them. All right. So one of the greatest predictors of success in any job is intelligence. And when you look at Ranger IQs, they are significantly higher than the rest of the population. So like when you look at the general population, IQs are a pretty big spread, right? But the Ranger average is a full standard deviation above the general population. So that means that the average Ranger IQ is already higher than 84% of the rest of the population. And specifically, when you break down IQ, you have different components. You have a verbal intelligence piece, which some people refer to it as crystallized intelligence. And so it's like what you get from school. It's like your vocabulary, how much knowledge you've acquired, things like that. Then you have performance intelligence, or what can be referred to as fluid intelligence. And so this is really what you're born with, like your ability to think quickly, to manipulate shapes in your head, to hold things in your short-term memory or your working memory. It's your ability to problem solve, essentially, and think in second and third order effects. And when I look at the data, Rangers are specifically higher in that fluid intelligence piece. And this is NCOs and officers. Like Rangers as a whole are very, very gifted when it comes to problem solving and figuring things out. They're more intelligent than the average individual. And so what I would tell a boss or an employer right off the bat, you're getting somebody who is more intelligent. One of the second predictors of job success is a personality trait called conscientiousness, and that is how achievement oriented, how disciplined, how organized you are. And as a whole, Rangers are more conscientious. They're more driven. They're more goal oriented than the average person. And then the third predictor is emotional stability. So Rangers are more emotionally stable than most people, but for a number of reasons. One is we screen out people that are not emotionally stable for the reasons I mentioned earlier. And then two, like you can build resilience through going through hardships. And like you think about the Ranger Regiment, you think about, I mean, as a psych, I went to Afghanistan 7 times, as a psych, right? And they were short trips, right? So it's nothing like what a typical Ranger is going through, or what they experience. But my point is that like Ranger Regiment was steadily deployed consistently through the war on terror, right? So from early 2000s all the way until we pulled out of Afghanistan, Rangers were there, and they rotated in and out. So and so you're going to have a population of people who have done some really, really hard stuff, and they are more resilient coming out the other side. And when you look at screening for psychological stability or emotional stability in the civilian sector, it's hard. There's lots of legal issues around that. Like the tests that I gave you guys at Ranger Regiment, I can't give the same tests to civilians, because there's certain laws and things in place that protect civilians, like the Americans with Disability Act and things like that. Like there's certain questions you can't ask civilians that you can military members. And so for an employer, when you get someone applying to your organization that served in the 75th Ranger Regiment, then you're getting someone who has gone through a psychological assessment and they've been deemed psychologically fit to serve in the organization, so that they're more resilient than most people. And not only that, but they're more conscientious, they're more intelligent, with a few exceptions. There's always outliers here and there,
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, so that's the positive side, right? And it's not all positive. Like I don't want to, make it sound like I'm, that I'm fanboying, Rangers. There are some challenges too, some leadership challenges. And so like the first piece is that you're going to have somebody that's more blunt and more direct, and they may ruffle feathers. And so you're going to need to coach them and understand that they don't mean anything by this. They don't mean this. They're not trying to be jerks. They're trying to do what's good for the organization. And so you're going to have to coach them and sort of shape that and not take it personally. And there's a greater level of rigidity. Rangers are very used to structure and checklists and things like that, because when you look at what keeps you alive and what makes sure that you've got everything squared away, checklist is your best friend. Well, in some places in the civilian world, people view that as too rigid and robotic, and so again, an employer is going to have to utilize that skill set where it helps and where it works, but also work with that Ranger and coach them and help kind of mold and shape some of those traits to where you can utilize them to where they will maximally benefit your organization. Because at the end of the day, if you take and you hone those skills in a certain way, you're going to have a really, really high speed employee that I think is going to be of great benefit to your team.
Yeah, that's good. So, some guys, struggle when they leave Ranger Regiment and they get out in the civilian world, and that whole, like you said about JFK, all a rising tide raises all boats. We've talked to some guys about that. And so from like a psychologist perspective, what are some, and we talked about also like you having good people around you in the first episode and surrounding yourself with people like that. Other than that, what are some things that guys can focus on a personal level to try to stay that mentally like focused or not get discouraged when, like you said, a guy can't find a job or school is like, I mean, they're smarter, than normal, but school's just difficult.
Yeah. 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 And they're smart on the fluid intelligence side. Specifically enlisted are higher with the fluid intelligence side than they are with the verbal crystallized intelligence. And so for a lot of Rangers, being in a classroom is like pulling teeth. And so they don't have like that fund of knowledge or vocabulary or whatever the academic kind of knowledge that other people would have, because they just weren't interested in that, because they want excitement and stimulation. But the fluid intelligence is absolutely there. And in my opinion, that's the stuff that matters more, for more skill sets. So this is going to surprise you, but I got a long-winded response to your question. So
That's good.
So I am a big fan of a psychological theory called self-determination theory. And it's by these guys named, the last names are Ryan and DC. And it's a big theory that sort of describes and predicts human behavior. It's made up of a bunch of mini theories, and one of the pieces of it that I find most valuable is what they call basic psychological needs. For anyone who's heard me on a different podcast, I'll sound like a broken record because I talk about this a lot, but I think it's really important, because it's a nice framework to know what conditions we need to be fulfilled. And Ranger Regiment kind of creates these conditions for us. And so when we leave regiment, we don't have them anymore. We have to create them for ourselves. And so the first one is autonomy. Autonomy is freedom, essentially. It's the ability to do what you want when you want to do it. And I know, like, when you think of autonomy and you think of regiment, you think, I don't know about that. Like, my life was like controlled, right? But like, what is the motto of regiment? Sua sponte, right? Your podcast is sua sponte. Like, it's of their own accord. Regiment Rangers are disagreeable by nature, and so they naturally march to the beat of their own drum. And like, one of the reasons I loved my job so much was I got freedom. Like, no one told me what to do, like how to spend my time. I knew what our mission was, and I marched forward, and I worked harder and longer in that role than I think I did anywhere else. And I think a lot of that was because I had autonomy. So autonomy is a basic human need. Mastery is another basic human need. So this is the need to progress and grow in something. All right. Think about your time at regiment. When you came in, you always had a goal in front of you. So if you came in, let's say a junior enlisted comes in with an option 40 contract, they got to get through basic to move on to OSIT, to move on to RASP. And so there's like all these little points of graduation. They get through RASP, they go to battalion, they got to go to Ranger school. And then you get in battalion, and then you have these different levels of leadership that you're moving towards. Like, before you know it, you're a squad leader, and then you work and work and work, and then fast forward down the road, you're a platoon sergeant, and then you work your way up. And so it is a constant state of growth, and there's these very deliberate checkpoints that you go through. And before you know it, you retire, and you're not even 40 years old, and all that structure is not there anymore. And so mastery is a big piece. And then the last one is probably the most removed when you get out, in my opinion, and they call it relatedness, but it's being a part of a group of like-minded people. It's being a part of a culture. You think about what makes a culture a culture. There's symbols, there's language, there's no stronger culture organizationally than the Ranger Regiment. You see a tambourine, you know what it means. There's a scroll, there's a tab, there's the Ranger Creed, there's all these things that make a Ranger, and not just the symbols, but then take what we've talked about in this podcast, the personality, the like-minded people. you've got a group of individuals that are all very similar in certain ways, and they're just great human beings, and they're impressive human beings, and you're part of that. And so when you leave the military, then at least two of those three things are gone by themselves, by default. Your tribe is, you are now no longer part of your tribe by default. And I say by default because, like, you're out of the regiment, you still have a tribe, you just, some people don't know it yet. That's the importance of staying involved, like the Three Ranger Foundation and their mentorship meets and their program, and like what you guys are doing with your podcast. Like, it's important to stay involved with this community. But when people leave, like, they're no longer part of the tribe. And as humans, like, that is a natural drive. We are tribal pack creatures, and when we don't have a pack, then we feel like we don't have a purpose. And so you take that person, they're out of the military, they have more autonomy than they know what to do with, which is fine, but there's no mastery, and then there's no relatedness. And so two of the three basic psychological needs are completely removed overnight. And it's, when you don't have those, that's a recipe for depression. I'll tell you, as a psychologist, I experienced that, and I knew what was going on. Like earlier when I told you, like, I need structure in my life, it's because, like, I was sleeping in, and I was going and kind of doing a workout, and then before I knew it, like, I didn't really feel accomplished. I didn't have that level of mastery there, and I was doing all this stuff alone. And so I didn't have that relatedness. And so, so my recommendation for anybody transitioning out is, one, with the autonomy piece. If you start a new job and you don't feel like it's a good fit, it's okay to leave and go somewhere else. A lot of times, a lot of former Rangers, they feel loyal. They feel like this blind loyalty to wherever they go, and they try to stick it out when it's not a good fit. So strive for autonomy is what I'm saying. If you feel like you don't have that kind of freedom, then that's going to affect your mental health. The mastery piece, either find some form of structure, whether it's like going to school, like, let's say you're wanting to pursue a graduate degree or whatever, that structure, or you have a company that has upward progression. And if you don't do that, like if you took a route like I did, where I became self-employed, you got to create that level of mastery and structure for yourself. You got to set those goals and figure out where you want to be this time next year, and then develop a concrete plan to get you down that path. And then the third piece is the relatedness piece. And I feel like Rangers struggle with this the most, because there's a lot of introverts in regiment for some reason, and people just kind of want to stick to themselves unless there's a forcing function that puts them outside of that. And so this is the piece where you got to be deliberate about reaching out and staying in touch with guys and building that social network, whether it's through giving back, like with the mentorship kind of stuff, or whether that's just being involved with like Ranger specific events. I mean, we just had Ranger Rendezvous, like staying tied in, I think is really, really important. So I got so long-winded on you, Ken, that I might've forgotten your question, but I think it was basically around like, what can people do to transition out? What's the tips or advice that I would have?
Yeah, no, I think that's good. I like you said, there's ways to stay connected. Three Rangers Foundation is doing a great thing. I mean, like, we're having a Ranger breakfast this Saturday where I live in Montana. So that it's happening all over the country. It's just, you don't know about it unless you ask. And sometimes it might be with guys that, like, a lot of my friends are 275 guys, or 175, and that's just how it happens to be. But there's guys out there, and so that might be like reaching out to Three Rangers Foundation and saying, hey, who's in my area? What do they do? And I think some guys have missed that, because I got out before, Three Rangers Foundation was really going, but I do feel like Sergeant Major Hall would have no problem with a guy following back around and saying, "Hey, who's in my area? What do they do?" Or helping him with the job.
Yeah. Yeah, and there's other programs out there too. Like Carl Monger and Tim Spalla. They last August, I went with them and a group of former Rangers up to Pikes Peak in Colorado, and we hiked up the mountain. I got altitude sickness like crazy. That was embarrassing, but made it to the top. Had to hop in the mid van going down, unfortunately, but it was a group of Rangers from different generations that were all for all day long hiking up this mountain, talking to each other. It was great. I had a blast, and so they're doing that yearly. Carl he's the founder of the Gallant Few, and so there's all these organizations out there. It's on the Ranger to figure out how he or she can plug in, and to understand that it's important. It's an important piece, not only to themselves, it's important to connect, but also you never know what kind of difference you're making to the other person that almost didn't reach out but decided to go try this event out, and then you start talking and you hit it off or whatever. We're definitely stronger together than we are alone. And so I think being a part of events like that and organizations like that is incredibly important.
So what would you say for a guy that gets out and he's kind of struggling, like you were saying, with depression, but really it was kind of like a symptom of you being out of routine, that's being told he needs medication or stuff like that. What route should they take? Should they do those fundamental things first, or?
Yeah. So I'm always a fan of trying the organic first. And so I'm a psychologist, which means I have a PhD in psychology. I'm not a psychiatrist, so a psychiatrist goes to med school and prescribe medications. So when I see somebody, if I were to see somebody for depression, then we're going to do therapy. I'm not going to introduce medications because I don't prescribe meds. And so what I usually recommend with any patients or clients that I've had for therapy is let's try the behavioral route first, and let's see what we can get accomplished that way. One technique that I like to do, one intervention that I like to do is it's called behavioral activation. And the whole idea behind it is that we all have values. And if we're not doing things that are in accordance with our values, then we're going to feel what we call cognitive dissonance. We're going to feel this turmoil, this inner turmoil. And so if you feel that enough, that your mood's going to suffer. If you value accomplishment and achievement, or let's say you value working out and you sit on the couch for a week long, you're going to create depression. And so what I do with people is I have them kind of track by the hour how they spend their time. And then they rate on a scale from 1 to 10 how important that activity is and how enjoyable that activity is. And so we do that for a week, and then we get a good baseline of just kind of how they're spending their day. And then we also get numbers for how fulfilling are their tasks, and then how much joy are they getting out of their tasks. Because if you look at those numbers and you have just a bunch of fulfilling stuff, or important stuff rather, and no enjoyment, then you're on the track to burnout. You're just working your fingers to the bone and you're never doing anything for pleasure, which is important. And then if you're reversed, then you're not gonna feel accomplished. If you've got nothing but enjoyable activities, if you're playing video games all day long and you're not getting anything done, you're gonna have fun in the moment, but then you're gonna feel like, what am I doing with my life, right? And so then the next step is I have them identify values, things that they find important in 5 different areas of their life. One is relationships. So an example, like for me, is I value being like a loving son to my parents, and so like that's a value that I can identify behaviors that are consistent with that. So like if I don't ever call my parents, if I call them once a month, then that's not consistent with that value. And so like that's a little piece of me that's gonna have some dissonance. And so relationships is one category. Education and career is another one, depending on where someone is in life. Another one is leisure activities, because hobbies are incredibly important, especially when you get out of the military. The fourth one is called mind, body, spirit. So it's more like physical activities, diet, spiritual stuff. And then the last one is daily responsibilities. And so this is just like if you value having a clean house, if you value having having a clean car, or whatever those chores that you have to do throughout your life are, you throw those in there. So at the end of it, you get this list of these values and these behaviors that are aligned with these values. And then you look at your schedule and you see, where can I plug some of these in that I'm not already doing? And with the idea that you start slow, it's that whole how do you eat an elephant one bite at a time kind of mantra, right? So you start slow, but you start to work these pieces into your schedule. And then you continue to kind of measure, track, and rate those days. And you just look at the numbers. If those enjoyment and importance scores are going up, then you should see an increase in your mood. You should see where you're feeling more joy, more fulfillment. You're pulling yourself out of that funk, because that goes way back to what we talked about with mastery. Like you're filling your day with these things that you value. If that doesn't work, then like there's nothing wrong with trying medications. And again, I'm not a prescriber, so like giving advice on medications is outside of my scope of competence. But I will absolutely, if things are not working for me, if somebody's still feeling depressed even after that, then I may refer them to somebody who could prescribe them a medication based on what they feel like would be necessary. And I've even had cases where I've had people who they've come in and they were in such a deep, dark hole that I said, hey, let's do both at the same time. Let's get you referred for some meds. That way that can help pull you out of the hole, where you will have the energy to start to do some of these things that we're trying to do. Because by definition, somebody who's depressed, they don't want to do things that they used to do, that they used to find fulfilling. They just have no energy to get out of bed. And so sometimes it can be bad enough to where they need that push, they need that help. And but my philosophy on medications is that in most circumstances, they should never be a long-term fix. This should be a temporary thing until we can get your schedule and your life in an order where you're able to do this on your own. Because at the end of the day, our jobs as therapists, as behavioral health people, should be to put ourselves out of a job. Like we should be helping somebody become their own therapist and get back on their feet, kind of like being fit for duty, right? Like it's kind of like they come in, we help get them back to the fight and send them back out to live their lives. So that's kind of my take on that piece, Ken.
Yeah, I think that's good. It goes back to what you're saying about that self-determinism nature. And also, I think having an understanding of that is good for guys, because from like a psychological standpoint, would you say that what you test for in vetting guys going into regiment would lead them to be less predisposed to having depression? Like, is there a gauge for that?
I mean, to an extent, and I'll explain what I mean. So, when you look at personality, you look at the leading theory in personality is called the 5-factor model, and it breaks personality down into 5 different components. So you have conscientiousness that I mentioned before, which is your work ethic and how organized you are. You have agreeableness, which is how like caring and cooperative you are. There's openness, which is how open you are to new experiences. Are you somebody who you're more routine oriented, or are you somebody who you like being spontaneous? And there's extroversion, which most people know about. Are you energetic and outgoing? And then there is what they call neuroticism. I alluded to this earlier when I mentioned emotional stability. It's just another name for it. And so neuroticism is a trait, which means it's part of us. And so some people are more prone to be anxious than others, and it's just part of them. It's part of their makeup. Like I'll give you myself as an example. When I was a kid, I was really socially anxious. Like I was scared to raise my hand in class because I was scared that I was going to sound stupid or something like that. And that carried through till college, and then it kind of through exposure. In grad school, I got better with it, and now it doesn't really bother me, but it's always kind of there, like it's a trait that's there. And so people that go through RASP, we're looking for traits, and there are some people who are predisposed to having a mood disorder or something in that kind of psychological disorder sort of realm that might predispose them to developing more problems or to worsening their problems if they were to experience a life like Ranger Regiment, to include combat, to include everything that goes along with that. It's not easy to go to Ranger school and be completely cut off from everybody in your life and just live in the suck for months on end, right? So that's part of it. So yes, we do attempt to screen out people that are predisposed to developing more problems if they were to come into an organization like Ranger Regiment. There are experiences in life though later that you can develop depression. Like everybody gets down, right? But like some people have situational circumstances in life where they experience depression. And that can be more situational. That can be, like there's exposure to traumatic events. Like sometimes people develop problems after being exposed to trauma. And so there's ways to treat that stuff. And so one way is what I mentioned earlier with behavioral activation. If somebody has experienced trauma in their lives and they're still kind of haunted by that, there's some really good treatments out there that can help them through that. One of those treatments is something called prolonged exposure therapy. And what that is so let's say somebody has a traumatic event. I always use the example of like you're held up at gunpoint at a gas station. And so it's just because there's like smells and sights and stuff at a gas station that are kind of unique. But so let's say somebody's held up at gunpoint at a gas station. Well, as human beings, we're wired to survive. And so let's say that person gave the mugger his wallet and survived, but the next time that person goes to a gas station, there's something that's going to be going, some alarm bells that are going to be going off in their head that's going to say, hey, you don't need to be here. Like, this is dangerous. And so maybe they don't get gas there. Maybe they go to the next station, or the extreme example is they just don't get gas. They're just like, I'll wait and do it tomorrow. Well, that trains them to avoid, because when they avoid the stimulus that's anxiety provoking, then it gives them relief. And then the next time they meet it, it's even stronger. And so you do have people that they start to develop this situation where, that's essentially PTSD, is that they were exposed to trauma. They are avoiding reminders of the event, and it's interfering with their life. And so at that point, you have things like prolonged exposure therapy, which in the therapy room, you would talk through that traumatic event over and over again until the anxiety goes down, because anxiety will go down with enough exposure. And then you build what's called a hierarchy of fears. And so there's like a building up to exposing them to the thing that is really anxiety provoking, which in this case would be them going to that exact gas station at that exact pump and pumping gas in their car. Now, the first step might be going to a different gas station and just parking and not getting out, so you slowly work your way up. But there's all kinds of behavioral treatments and interventions and things that can help people like that. But I guess I wanted to provide that clarification because I don't want what I'm saying to sound like that we screen out anybody who could become depressed or have problems at regiment, and then anybody that does, it's a different situation. That's not the case. Like we're human. We all have situations to where our mood fluctuates or whatever. It's just part of life. But the point is that there are, whatever is going on, there's absolutely some good treatments out there that can help get that person back to, on their feet and back to the fight.
Well, and why I asked the question is we all go to the VA when we get out, and the VA therapist might look at us as all the same. Mm-hmm. And all I'm saying is if we're not necessarily predisposed to depression as much as like a normal person, and whatever normal is, I don't know. I'm just saying, if we're not predisposed to that, maybe that's something a ranger should say, to say, hey, I know I'm a little bit different and you might conceive this as depression, but maybe I need to just, do some of the things you've said of being aware of, how I'm spending my time, what I'm doing, what I'm adding value to, what I'm not, and doing that before going to the VA and being like, hey, I feel down, I feel unmotivated, I feel sad and depressed, and maybe it's because I'm not around my ranger buddies anymore.
Yeah. I always tell people you're a driver of your own treatment, and be a self-advocate, right? Like if you go see somebody at the VA and they immediately, and you tell them you're like, I'm just not feeling like, I'm a shell of myself and I'm not feeling good, and they want to push meds and you don't want to take meds, you have a right to say that. You have a right to say, hey, I would rather know what other treatment options are available. And if there's a behavioral piece, because you're rangers, you're willing to do the work. If there's a piece that's more difficult, but it's better for the long term, and like, you deserve to know about that, and you deserve to be able to say, hey, that's what I would rather try. A good therapist is going to be like a co-pilot with you. Like you're going to be in this together. It's not like a power dynamic. And so it should be a collaborative conversation. And I always tell people too, it's probably a bad comparison, but therapy, it's almost like dating, right? Like you need to be compatible with your therapist, and sometimes you're just not. Like sometimes you just don't really click, and it doesn't really work. And it's okay to go find somebody else. I want to provide a caveat though, because I've seen, going back to what we said earlier about there being multiple sides to every story. I've seen pitfalls with rangers though, where either number one, they're very quick to judge, and they're quick to make a decision or a judgment on somebody. So let's say someone goes in, they meet with a therapist, and they feel this gut feeling like, I don't like this person. They're quick to take off and go and just not come back. And my recommendation would be to kind of push through that gut feel for a minute and give them a chance, and then make the decision, because it could be something else. It could be like, they could remind you of somebody. They could be, they're nervous too. Like they're sitting in front of a special operations individual with some really impressive credentials. They don't want to screw it up. So maybe they're not like being their true self, and you're picking up on that like disingenuousness. And so maybe you just need to kind of work through that, where you guys can work together and get to know each other before you call it quits. So that's recommendation number one, or something to consider. A second thing is this interesting phenomenon that's called the Dunning-Kruger effect. And it's this idea that like the less you know about something, the more you think you know about it. And so like that's why when Israel and Palestine, when they had their situation, was that back in October? That all of a sudden we had a bunch of experts on foreign affairs on Facebook. Like you have all these people who like they think that they just know everything about this, right? And what's interesting and something that I learned in grad school is that the more you learn about something like a field, the deeper you go, the more you realize how much you don't know. And there's an element of humility to that. So like when I graduated with my bachelor's in psychology, I kid you not thought I just knew everything about psychology, and then I get to grad school and I realize I don't know anything about this field of psychology. And then by the time I got out, when I graduated with my doctorate, then I was like, we don't know anything as a field about anything, because like there's just so much unknown. There's so many things out there. There's so much gray area. And so I say that to say that if you're going in to see with a therapist or a psychiatrist or whoever, on one hand, be an advocate for yourself and make sure you speak up and you say, hey, this is my preference. This is what I would like, and give them a chance. But on the other hand, they have a lot of knowledge too. And, if you're quick to kind of dismiss what they say or judge what they have to say, my recommendation would be just to kind of give it a second chance, to just sort of listen, just to take it a step further before you really fully make up your mind so you can make that well-informed decision and then act. Because you could just be like at this breaking point where you're just about to get over the crest to where you really have some progress with the person. So I know I said a lot of like contradictory stuff there, but it's a complicated sort of topic. But that would be my recommendation for folks that are going to the VA or whatever behavioral health resources they have.
Yeah, well, I think it's a complicated issue because you don't know if someone is actually facing chemical depression or if it's that self-determinism that they aren't doing anymore. And so I think it's good that you covered both of those.
Yeah. I wish it were a more concrete field. The side of me that like craves structure craves like this concreteness in the field of psychology. There's a reason why chemists say that psychology is not a hard science. I would argue that it is a hard science, but a different sense of the word hard. It's much more difficult to be able to measure things that you can't see and can't touch and stuff. So it's definitely made me appreciate the gray in lots of things, especially as it pertains to human behavior.
Well, and I don't know if you want to discuss this or not, but one of the things that has helped me since getting out of Ranger Battalion and finding those things you listed before, like community and all that, has been church. Where does that fit with, like, in the world of psychology, with that objective black and white reality, good versus evil? God says I should do these things. To get to heaven, I need to do this or whatever.
Yeah. I have a bunch of thoughts. So the first is I generally don't bring religion into my practice. Like I really separate the two, and I generally don't discuss religion in a professional context. But for a big reason is I don't want it to color how people view what I say in terms of our ability to work together. So what I mean by that, like, let's say I'm working with somebody who is I'm working with somebody in therapy. And let's say that they are on the polar opposite end of religious. Let's say that they are very clearly atheist. And I bring anything religious into the interaction, or I make it known that I'm religious, and it completely turns them off and it discredits anything else that I say. Or the complete opposite end of the spectrum, where somebody is extremely religious and I am outspoken that I'm not. and it completely, they're like, well, this guy, I can't trust anything he says, right? And so I don't say that to be disingenuous. I just understand how powerful of a value that is for people on both ends, right? Now, with that being said, going back to the values piece that I said earlier, the mind, body, spirit section, if religion is a big value of yours, then I think it's extremely important that you get involved in as many ways as you can with your church. Because the more you do that, the more sense of community you're going to have, the more sense of like a greater purpose you're going to have. Like there's a lot of really, really strong benefits for being involved with church. And occasionally I will mix psychology and religion. And I'll give you an example of what I mean. So there is some research where they found that if partners pray for one another, they're less likely to commit adultery. Now, there's a couple of elements of that, but from a psychology perspective, if I'm praying for my partner and I'm praying for her well-being and for her protection and all of this stuff, then I'm behaving in a way that is, I'm demonstrating love. I'm demonstrating love and affection and care and all these good things for my partner, even if I'm by myself, even if it's in my head. And so what that does is that the more we say things, the more we write things down, the more we think things, the stronger those beliefs become. And so if I'm praying for my partner every day, well, when it comes time when that temptation strikes or whatever, I have like some psychological barriers that are protecting me from acting on those things. And so like that's an example where I would bring those in. But really, for the most part, my method when I work with people is to work with them where they are. I'm not going to bring a lot of my stuff into the equation because I think it just biases what's going on. So I hope you don't think I dodged your question, Ken. But that's kind of how I view that piece.
No, I think it's good. And I think you make a good point about turning people off to what you're saying, because I think you have important things to say. And like, I think that's a great example. I think it's research-based, it's factual. It's also, most religions pray. I mean, it's not, or meditate, whatever you want to say. So I think that's good, but I also think it's good how you premised it in saying, this is the research that supports this behavior. Mm-hmm. Because there's a lot of behaviors and actions in the Bible, like that self-determinism stuff, like there's a lot of like, it's up to you. Like you got to get out there. Like you can't expect a handout. There's some things I've learned about like depression. A lot of it is, it can sometimes be related to selfishness and thinking I deserve more, I deserve better. And so a lot of those things religion has taught me. And I just wonder how religion would affect somebody on like a psych exam. And maybe there's not really a test out there.
Yeah, I see what you're saying. Yeah, I've seen that. Our tests, the ones that we use, the scores are based on norms. So they're based off of how hundreds of thousands of people have answered the same questions. So generally, to have outliers, you have to be pretty different, and so I will occasionally see someone who is hyper religious and had like a really religious upbringing look like they are trying to unrealistically look good on site testing, if that makes sense. Like the profile will look like they are lying to me.
Yeah.
And so the solution there is I just dig into their background in the interview. And when I find out they, were Mormon or whatever, then I'm like, okay, that makes sense. So it can affect things in that way. But in terms of everything else, like personality is, I don't think I've seen any literature that would suggest that personality is shaped, by religion. Yeah. 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 You got me thinking now.
Well, I just didn't know if it would create a more assertive person, because religion does create that very, good versus evil, black and white nature to say this is right and this is wrong. And when I see wrong, I'm going to stand up for it. And so I could see where it could force that assertive card more.
Yeah. Yeah. I could see that as well. Because if you're comfortable with your morals, if your morals are grounded in something like religion, then it's easier to see when things go against those, and then based on your own philosophy that that's wrong. I'm going to speak out, against it. Um, my only thing there, and I'm just thinking out loud here, but Rangers are also, compared to other people, more morally straight and duty bound. And so they're more likely to pull that trigger and say, hey, this is wrong, than someone else. And it could be perceived as being more rigid. And there are some roles and jobs and things that require more rigidity and less rigidity than others. Like there's, I'm trying to think of an example. Like I'm thinking of like a car salesman, right? Like a car salesman has to be able to be persuasive and maybe a little bit indirect. And I don't think I'm sure there are some Rangers that would be good at that, but I think for the most part, most of them, they would not want to do that. Because Rangers are much more straight laced and they don't like to manipulate. So they would not be a good fit in that kind of industry, in my opinion.
Yeah.
Or politics, for example. Whereas, doing something
Being
else.
like a waitress or a server, oh my goodness. Like I hear people complain about food and I'm like, why do you get an option? Like eat the tomato. They'll bring you the tomato, you pull it off. Like they don't need to pull your tomato off.
Yeah.
Anyways.
Great example. Yeah. Think of the MREs. How many MREs we've eaten in Dahlonega, the mountains of Dahlonega, Georgia. Yeah, man. The blueberry pancakes are good though.
Yeah. Well, Jeremy, I really appreciate your time. I thank you for your outlook on things. I really hope that this helps guys. Hopefully it'll drive them. Is there any ways that, guys could reach out to you for help or articles or just your website or what?
Yeah, totally. Yeah. So my website is psychology.consulting. So I snagged it because it had a bunch of Google traffic, so it's easy to find. But then I'm posting on a pretty regular basis on social media. So my company is Noble Organizational Consulting. So if you just search that in any social media, you'll see it. But so I've got a Facebook page, I've got an Instagram page. I mostly post on LinkedIn, and that's just Jeremy Noble. So you'll see me. I've got a beard in the picture, so it might throw you off. But yeah, so I try to post weekly. For a while, I was doing it 3 times a week. But as I get busy, it's just me, right? So it's, I can't keep up, but I try to post free content. So I'll post things like what we talked about here today. I'll do some quotes. You'll see Sergeant Major Hall's quotes pop up quite a bit, most likely. But yeah, so there's my website, there's that. And anybody can reach out on any of those venues and hit me up. I'd be more than happy to talk to anyone who had any questions about any of this stuff. I do take on coaching clients. So if anybody's interested in that, just hit me up. I do a 50% discount for Rangers. Yeah, so just throwing that out there.
That's great. Well, Jeremy, like we always say, Rangers lead the way.
Hey, all the way.